the criminals are operating in networks. Banks and fintechs need to leverage also their own network effects. Otherwise, it's impossible. No single bank, no single fintech can ever beat criminal networks that typically operate across institutions. It's important to share information in a compliant way, of course, and it's important to pick up those new trends and tactics before they become commonplace everywhere. My name is Georg. I'm the COO at Hawk AI, a software provider for banks, fintechs, and payment firms that helps to fight financial crime. But more recently, I'm also known as the former General Manager of N26 in the German-speaking markets in Northern Europe. Hawk AI is truly helping banks and fintechs to, on the one side, address financial crime in the way that regulators know it, by rules, like automated rules, but at the same time it adds a layer of machine learning capabilities in order to make the overall AML system more efficient and more precise. One of the biggest challenges for financial institutions nowadays is that the vast number of potentially suspicious transactions are actually eventually false positives. So 95% of all transactions that are being flagged as suspicious turn out to be false positives. So meaning by drastically reducing those false positives, you essentially help the compliance teams to focus on those transactions and those accounts that truly matter. Vice versa, of course, we also help identify transactions that otherwise would have gone completely unnoticed, but the vast majority of the efficiency comes from reducing those false positives. I mean, if you imagine if, let's say, a large bank has hundreds, if not thousands, of compliance employees, and imagine every single time you look at the transaction and you know that there's a 95% chance that this is a false positive, you become somewhat numb to what you're looking at, especially because typically you only have a few minutes per transaction, and you might actually be missing the one transaction that is truly the criminal one. So we not only enable banks to become more efficient in how they are structuring the teams, but we also want to help them to refocus their teams on certain topics that really matter. So the reality is there might be thousands of transactions of individuals that all amount to a few hundred euros, which all turn out to be false positive. But there's one transaction that is much more complex and where it's about millions of euros, and it might have looked completely legitimate on the first glance. And because they only spent a couple of hours maybe on checking that, because they didn't have the time to really truly understand it, it just remains unnoticed. So the reality is there are very few people that are more creative than criminals, because they use the most modern technologies out there. They will every week try to reinvent themselves, and so ultimately it's really an arms race. While criminals constantly innovate, banks and other financial institutions also have to innovate. You always have to catch up with how criminals are reinventing themselves. So what does it mean? So first of all, it is paramount to leverage AI to its fullest, because otherwise you have no chance to fight criminals that are also using AI. Second, you need to be really quick to react when new money laundering techniques emerge. And very often what happens is, let's say a new technique emerges in France or UK or maybe in Asia. You need to react and learn from that before it becomes commonplace in your own country. And we are doing that. We are sharing the patterns. The moment we pick them up, we share them with all our customers. So that way you can be one step ahead of criminals before they pick it up in Lithuania or in Sweden or Denmark. Indeed, the criminals are operating in networks. Banks and fintechs need to leverage also their own network effects. Otherwise, it's impossible. No single bank, no single fintech can ever beat criminal networks that typically operate across institutions. It's important to share information in a compliant way, of course, and it's important to pick up those new trends and tactics before they become commonplace everywhere. So I think there are many ways that you can try to fraud banks or try to spoof accounts, spoof identities in order to essentially try to appear legitimate while you're not. It's basically an unlimited amount of doing that. But meanwhile, fintechs have to identify the anomalies among the thousands or millions of different possibilities that are out there. I'm going to give you an example. Imagine a restaurant that looks completely legitimate. Every single transaction they do is legitimate. But if you compare that specific restaurant, let's imagine a steak restaurant in Sweden, in Stockholm. Imagine you can compare this steak restaurant with other steak restaurants in Stockholm at that precision level, and you identify one restaurant has a different transaction pattern than all the others. It might be at a level that is so subtle that no criminal can ever plan for it. It just happens because they might use a certain type of accounts that is unusual, that it happens coincidentally. There might be certain types of timing peaks that are unusual. So it's just kind of AI can spot anomalies by comparing millions of data points, which no human could ever do. And that's how you catch criminals. So I believe it can become a competitive advantage in three ways. So first of all, it's about survival. As a matter of fact, fintech that becomes large enough to become really relevant for the regulator. If they're not compliant with regulators, they might lose the license and then they're shut down. So that's survival. The second piece is about trust. If you can prove to the regulator that you really know how to spot criminals, this is also a trust factor. The regulator trusts you, and then the public also trusts you. Because a bank or a fintech that is known to be regularly supporting criminals, and as a matter of fact, imagine your fintech would be known to be used by Russia to circumvent sanctions, that's a trust issue. And then last but not least, it's also on the customer level, because anti-money laundering and fraud means that fintech might react to those clients, might block their account, might block their transactions. And if you don't have sufficient technology and team size, you might have a massive backlogs of closed and blocked accounts. And suddenly these customers might complain on social media. They're really furious that their accounts are being blocked. And these customers might be completely innocent. So if you're not able to differentiate between criminals and innocent customers in real time, you might have a serious issue with your own customer base. I love the Lithuanian fintech system because it's extremely fast growing, a lot of passion here, combined with a lot of support from politics. The overall regulatory framework is very progressive. There are a lot of politicians that truly support fintechs and actually understand the value that fintechs bring for the ecosystem, versus in a lot of other European markets, whether it's the large banks that dominate politics, that dominate the lobbying. I really enjoyed here that people are actually understanding the value that fintech brings to the market.